So we're going to talk about the French Revolution, but before I really get into it, I've got a little bit of trivia, just some interesting facts about the French Revolution and the years leading up to it that you might be interested in. In the 1730s, there was a group of printing apprentices in Paris who massacred, as they said, quote, every cat we could find. And this was on a particular street, the Rue Saint-Severin in Paris. And the cats were rounded up. They were put on trial. It was a mock trial, but it was still a trial. And they were found guilty of witchcraft and hanged. So why would this happen? Well, you've got all these apprentices printing apprentices who were treated very poorly by their masters. And quite often the masters would give them cat food, which would be scraps of old rotten meat, and they'd give them that to eat. And this is food that the cats themselves wouldn't even eat. And then they just didn't treat the apprentices very well in general. So one apprentice in particular wanted revenge. So he spent several evenings sitting outside his master's bedroom window, howling and meowing. And so this goes on for several nights, and you've got several nights where the master can't sleep, and he believed that he and his wife were being bewitched, because witches have cats, and logically in his mind, that's witchcraft, because these cats are sitting outside his window. So he ordered that all the cats on the street be rounded up and killed. And as I said, they are. They're rounded up, they're put on trial, they're hung. Now, some historians actually look at this incident as an early instance of workers' revolt, of workers standing up for themselves, something that we'll see happening again in the French Revolution a few decades later. And then another interesting fact is that the first public zoo was actually created in Paris during the French Revolution. One of the early governments of the French Revolution, the National Assembly, passed a law that said that all exotic animals that were held by individuals privately had to be donated to this menagerie at Versailles. If they weren't, they were going to be killed, stuffed, and donated to scientists. And so most people gave their animals up, and thus you have the first public zoo. So here are the terms. As always, write them down, listen for them as we talk, and familiarize yourself with them. So why did millions of French people suddenly revolt against institutions that their ancestors had just accepted for hundreds of years? Well, ways of life that once served people pretty well can become rigid over time and stop working. New conditions change the way people see their world, and what seems reasonable in one age may later seem hateful and unnecessary in a later age. And this is exactly what happens in France. The ideas of the Enlightenment are present, and people are thinking for themselves, and they're questioning the way things are in France, and they're realizing that it's not real great. By the 1770s, the old institutions of monarchy and feudalism, which was that medieval system that tied peasants to the land and the aristocracy, they're realizing that this no longer worked for France. Now, as a group, these institutions were known as the Old Regime. So the Old Regime is this system of institutions where you have the monarchy at the top of society, where you have the peasants, the serfs at the bottom of society, and the aristocracy in between, with a lot of privileges that other groups don't have. Since the Middle Ages, the people of France had been divided into separate categories, separate social status. So they're divided into three large social classes, or estates, as they were known in France. And at the very top of it all, again, you have the monarch. But you have the first estate, which is the church, the clergy. That's 1% of the total population. The second estate is the aristocracy, again, 1% of the total population. The third estate is everyone else. 98%. So as you can see, this is the bulk of the population. And when I say everyone else, it's really covering several categories of people, several different levels. At the very bottom, you have the peasants. But within the third estate, you also have the middle class, which is the working class of business people, lawyers, doctors, shop people, business owners, and so forth. So you have really two separate groups within the third estate. You've got the peasants who are at the bottom of society and really have nothing. And then you have the middle class, which has money and jobs, but they do not have political power. They do not have a voice in society. So here you see a political cartoon of the time which shows the relationship between the estates. You see a member of the third estate carrying members of the first and second. This is because the old regime worked really well for members of the first and second estate. They have wealth. They have a lot of special privileges under the law. For example, they are exempt from taxes. It's the third estate that pays all the taxes, fights in the wars, and so forth. And so, as you can see from this picture, the third estate is carrying society. And so imagine, you're living at this time, you're a member of the third estate. Would you think that was very fair? Here is an excerpt from a pamphlet that was printed during this period of time, written by a clergyman, and it's called "What is the Third Estate?" Thus, what is the third estate? Everything, but in everything shackled and oppressed. What would it be without the privileged order? Everything, but in everything free and flourishing. Nothing can progress without it. Everything would proceed infinitely better without the others. The nobility does not belong to the social organization at all. Indeed, it may be a burden upon the nation. So, the man who wrote this was named Abbé Sieyès. And he is saying, basically, that the third estate, these people at the bottom, they are society. But, as he says, they're, quote, shackled and oppressed. And he's saying that the nobility up at the top of society, they're just a burden because they're being carried by everyone else. So again, imagine you're a member of this third estate. You wouldn't be happy about this situation. Well, about 98% of France's population belonged to the third estate. And what was happening was that many of the poor in the cities were going hungry. The peasants lost more than half of their income in taxes to the nobles, the church, and the king. The middle class, or the bourgeoisie, many of whom had become wealthy, yearned for social status and political power. And to give you an idea of the importance of bread in this society, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, French citizens ate about 2 pounds of bread every day. That was the average. And what's going to happen is the king, Louis XVI, is just horrible at finances. There's going to be a lot of financial mismanagement. And the cost of a loaf of bread, the staple food item of the peasant, is going to skyrocket to about a month's salary. And so people are literally starving in the streets. They cannot afford to buy food. When this revolution begins, we're going to see that this revolution, beginning in 1789, is going to put France on the political map of Europe. France is going to become a symbol for revolution and power to the people. We see long-held social tensions driving the revolution forward. There's heated debates about human rights. Who gets them? Who doesn't? It's an age of enlightened concepts and enlightened despotism. All of these things are connected to and help move towards the French Revolution. Some other things that help lay the groundwork for the French Revolution. The French and Indian War. The king had committed France to this war, also being fought on the continent as the 7 Years' War. They lost their territory in the New World, and spent a huge fortune doing so. So it really hurt their finances. Add to that, if you recall when I talked about Louis XIV, he died in 1715, but his mismanagement of the finances lays the groundwork for the kings who follow during the rest of the century. They're all going to be struggling to get the money they need to do the things they want, fight wars, expand, but also to run their country. At the same time, a lot of this money is spent on themselves and their lavish lifestyle. And Versailles is a prime example. Think of the money that would have to go into Versailles for the upkeep. Plus, the kings who followed Louis XIV continued to expand and build onto Versailles, which means it's just a constant source of revenue going out of the treasury. The French Revolution was a turning point in modern civilization. It inspired modern politics and political movements. It gave birth to new ideas and the concepts of liberty and government. It inspired worldwide reform and revolutionary movements, all devoted to the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, with fraternity referring to the brotherhood of all French citizens. It established a model and a pattern for subsequent revolutions. It's just this watershed moment in Western social and political history, this historic moment that sought to wipe the slate clean and redraw the social and political system. It had a lasting impact on our ideas of politics and society. By the end, it had destroyed the old regime, which was the social and political hierarchy based on privilege of birth. It destroyed the monarchy and the aristocracy, and in doing that, it privileged the political and social authority of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and to a lesser extent, the common person. It did away with the medieval feudal system of rights, privileges, and obligations, which had enslaved the lower classes. The state had been an extension of the royal will. The monarch's motto was, "I am the state." Well, the French Revolution destroyed the link between the state and the monarch, and it replaced it with a modern state where loyalties are to the nation, not to the king. The 18th century was a time of great hope, invigorated by the new ideas of the Enlightenment. But while the Enlightenment thinkers spoke of hope, the reality was an inequality between the monarchy, church, and aristocracy, and the masses. In the next century, Charles Dickens would write, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Reformers spoke of reform while French peasants struggled to survive. They lived in an atmosphere of violence, fear, oppression, and superstition. So let's look again at some of the major causes of the French Revolution. You've got the French and Indian War, as I said before, fought in the colonies, the New World, known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, where it was fought. Cost a lot of money. You've got the financial mismanagement of King Louis XVI and those who came before him. So by the time we get to 1789, there's not much money left. There's the ideas of the Enlightenment. You've got philosophes talking about things like natural rights, equality, the idea that a government is there to protect the person's rights, and if the rights are abused, if the government abuses its position, people are justified in rising up and overthrowing that government. And then you have the American Revolution, which began a decade before the French Revolution, and as we know, the Americans won, overthrew the British tyranny, and established their own independent nation. And this is going to be a huge incentive to the French, because they're going to see what the colonists did, and they're going to be inspired to do it themselves. The king during the French Revolution was Louis XVI. He had come to the throne at the age of 19, and he quite often felt that he was just woefully inadequate for the job. He wasn't dumb, he was intelligent, and he actually spent the first part of his reign trying to make reforms in his country, some of them based on Enlightenment ideals. For example, he pushed the idea of religious toleration. He wanted to free the serfs. And he wanted to reform the budget, the finances. He even published, or wanted to publish, the expenses of the country, including all of the debt, so that the people could see it. He felt that public opinion was very important. He made some very bad decisions, however. France took out some very large international loans, and he brought on board advisors who didn't really handle the situation very well. One of them even came up with the idea of the country increasing their spending so they could buy their way out of debt. Bottom line, the financial crisis France was in got worse and worse and worse. Louis took it as a personal failure and just felt that he had failed in his job as a monarch, and he kind of lost interest. The king and queen lived at Versailles, and this was the center of their government. And, we talked about this with Louis XIV. I mentioned a few slides ago that the monarchs who followed continued to add on to Versailles, continued to expand, and so it's a huge expenditure. The monarchs at the time, Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. She was actually a member of the Austrian royal family. Her brother was Joseph II, one of the enlightened despots I talked about, and her marriage to her husband was arranged. She was 14, he was 15, and they actually met 2 days before their wedding. But it seems to have turned out okay for them. However, she was not very popular among the people. She was used to living a certain lifestyle. Her people referred to her as Madame Deficit because it was felt that she was spending the country even more into bankruptcy. She spent so much money on her clothing, her lavish clothes, her lavish parties, the food she ate, and so forth, while her people were starving. And she seemed to be totally immune to the reality of the situation of her people, which just inspired hatred among them. So she wasn't very popular. And here's an example of why she was unpopular. She wanted to know what the life of a peasant was like. So she ordered that a little village, her hamlet, be built on the grounds of Versailles. And that's what you see here, a portion of this little hamlet. So an entire village was built. Whenever she felt the need or the desire to go through to see what a peasant's life was like, peasants would be brought in from the countryside and put to work. And then Marie Antoinette would drive through and just observe. So imagine the power that takes to be able to do that, and the helplessness of those at the bottom of society who have to come. They can't say no. So how do we get to a revolution? And what was it like at first? Well, at the outset, the French Revolution was a conservative movement, a reform movement rather than a revolution. And what ends up happening is that the French government, it's deeply in debt. So the king's advisors hoped to avoid bankruptcy by taxing the nobles. The nobles, though, refused to pay taxes unless the king called a meeting of the Estates General. So what is the Estates General? Well, it's part of the old or the ancient regime. It was France's version of Parliament, a representative body where members of each of the states would come to discuss and vote on issues. Problem was, they had not met since 1614. But reluctantly, Louis calls a meeting of the estates on May 1st of 1789. And this is the beginning, almost, of the revolution. What happens is the representatives all come together and they begin to discuss the issue. Now, the first and second estates had dominated the Estates General in the Middle Ages. They still expected to do this in 1789. So they're discussing the issue. Should the nobility be taxed? Now think about it. If you were a member of the nobility, you didn't pay taxes, but now you're voting on whether or not you should. What are you going to vote? Well, as you can imagine, the nobles, they're going to vote no. Problem was, under the estate's medieval rules, each estate was to meet in its own hall and then vote either for or against a given proposal. And in the final decision, each estate would only have one vote. So what that meant was the first and second estate could always outvote the third estate 2-1. So they're meeting in 1789, and the third estate says no. This needs to change. We all need to meet together. And they said the votes of each member should count equally. Instead of each estate having one vote, it should be one man, one vote, basically. And one reason for this was that there were 591 members of the first and second estates combined. There were 610 members of the third estate, so they outnumbered the other two estates combined. And the nobles are like, well, no, we don't want to do that. Same with many of the clergy. The king sided with the nobles. The third estate disagreed. So the third estate's mad, and they storm out, along with a few reform-minded members of the first and second estates. And they meet on a nearby tennis court, and they continue with their discussion. Now, this discussion, this debate, as it becomes, is going to go on for several weeks. So all of this doesn't happen in one day. And they discuss, and they discuss, and they discuss, and they finally agree to create an organization known as the National Assembly. And the job of the National Assembly is going to be to pass laws and reforms in the name of the French people. So on June 17th of 1789, a vote is taken and the National Assembly is created. And this vote was the first deliberate act of revolution. And at first, the National Assembly is really successful and very popular. One reason was it had the support of the French people, 98% of the population. On July 14th of 1789, the Bastille fell. This was a symbol of support. So what was the Bastille? Well, it's located in Paris, and it was an old fortress that had been converted into a state prison. So now, in 1789, it's a political prison. It's also a symbol to the Third Estate of the despotism, the authority of the monarchy. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with their country. And so what happened was that on the morning of July 14th, women around Paris went to the bakeries to get their bread. Doors are locked. There's no bread. People begin congregating at the Bastille because it's this symbol of everything they despise. And as the day wears on, more and more people show up. And you've heard that saying, mob mentality. Well, that's what happens here. Within this building, it was a political prison. There were several prisoners, not very many. And there were also weapons. It was also an armory. And so what happens is, eventually these people have had enough and they storm the Bastille. And it's violent. For example, they cut off the head of one of the guards and put it on a pike, and they're waving it around as they run through the Bastille, freeing prisoners and grabbing weapons. This is important because this is the first
act of violence of the French Revolution. And the mob consisted of all sorts of people. They called themselves the National Guard, and they actually organized themselves, and they really thought, many of them, that they were attacking this symbol of royal despotism. They said they had to protect themselves from the treacherous king, from the nobles and the clergy. They also, though, really wanted to get the guns and swords and so forth, which were stored there. And so, as I said, this is the first act of violence of the French Revolution. Now, interesting fact, the Bastille no longer exists. There was an enterprising guy who saw what this meant to the people, and people actually started taking mementos from the building, like little stones and bricks. And so this guy dismantled this building brick by brick and sold them. Made a fortune for himself, but the building itself dwindled until it no longer existed. Also, if you go to France today in the summer, in July, you might be there when they celebrate Bastille Day. It's a huge national holiday every July 14th in France. After the Bastille fell, word of what happened started to spread. These events drove the Assembly to a series of sweeping reforms, inspired by the ideals of the Enlightenment. They realized that they had to regain control. So, on August 4th, they passed the August 4th Decrees, sometimes known just as the August Decrees. These abolished the special privileges of the Catholic Church and the nobility. By doing that, by abolishing privilege, they were creating an equal opportunity society, one based on merit and talent, not birth and privilege. They also abolished feudalism, the system that tied the peasants to the aristocracy. The aristocracy could no longer collect taxes and so forth from the peasants. They tried to also dismantle the privileges of the Catholic Church. The Assembly curtailed the Church's influence in all affairs and tried to nationalize church lands. So what we see happening is, step by step, the old regime is being dismantled. The Assembly also tried to create a rational, uniform administrative structure. Noble titles and government offices were not to be sold. This practice was abolished by the Assembly. The reformers of the Assembly also reached a consensus on a constitution which created a constitutional monarchy. And then, in August 1789, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen was released, and this document expressed the Revolution's fundamental beliefs of liberty and equality. The Declaration focused on the concept of popular sovereignty, which meant that the political legitimacy for any government depends on the consent of the people. A government is legitimate because it rests on the will of the people. So, popular sovereignty meant government by and for the people. Does that sound familiar? Think of our government. The Declaration also stated that men are born free and have equal rights. They have due process under the law, freedom of religion, property ownership, freedom of speech and the press, and no taxation without representation. It stated that the whole purpose of government was to protect these basic rights. Well, the Declaration inspired reformers in many lands. It also gave rise to debates which helped to push the revolution forward. I've mentioned some of the changes that are taking place. We've got the Bastille, the Great Fear, the August Decrees, and then the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. So that's progress. The reality, though, is that many of the common, ordinary working people had yet to see any change in their lives. They're still starving. And so, on October 5th of 1789, one of the pivotal events of the French Revolution occurred. A group of about 7,000 common working women marched on the Palace of Versailles. Now, many of these women were
fisherwomen. They worked down on the docks, and these ships would come in with large crates of fish, and they would unload them. And so these were big, burly, powerful women. And these women were armed with pikes and muskets and pitchforks, and they marched their way to Versailles. About 20,000 National Guardsmen had actually been called in to protect the royal family. They weren't able to stop these women as they stormed the gates. And as they were marching, they even had a drum keeping the beat. They were chanting, "Bread, bread, bread," because that's what they were lacking. They were starving. And so they get to the palace, and their focus is Marie Antoinette. For many of them, she had just become this symbol of despotism, this symbol of gluttony. She's living in her palace, enjoying her fine life, her fine food, her fine clothes, while her people are starving. And so they rampaged into the palace. A group of them even made it to her private quarters, and she only narrowly escaped with her life by making her way through a secret passage to the king's more secure quarters. 2 of her guards weren't quite so lucky. They were captured by the women and beheaded, and their heads were put on pikes and waved around as they continued to rampage through the palace. Well, they end up going out into the front courtyard, and they refuse to leave until Marie Antoinette comes out to face them. And so finally, she came out on the balcony with her children in front of her, kind of like she was using them as a shield almost. The women demanded that she face them alone, so the children were sent back inside. And they demanded food. They were furious that their monarchs were isolated out at Versailles, living a life of pleasure, while their subjects were literally starving in the streets. And many of you may have read or heard that Marie Antoinette said, "Well, let them eat cake." She never actually said that, but it still kind of sums up her attitude. She and the king were just totally removed from the suffering of their people. And so this is going to be a pivotal event, as I said, because changes have been made up to this point, but like I mentioned, they're not really impacting all the people. At this point, these women demand that the king and queen return to Paris and see the suffering of their people firsthand. And so the king and queen are going to return to Paris, and they will become prisoners of the Third Estate up until they are executed a couple of years later. By 1791, the moderate phase had turned a little more radical. There's social pressures from the working class that are building up. And these are people known as the sans-culottes. They are the group who most wanted democratic voting rights and more equality. They wanted fixed prices to fix inflation, and more taxes on merchants and bankers, among other things. Now, they were called the sans-culottes because of the way they dressed. The aristocrats, as you can see in this picture, wore knee-length pants, silky pants, known as culottes. The middle and lower classes wore long pants, so they were without the culottes, without the fancy pants, basically. And it was a visible identifying sign of which class you belonged to. Well, pressure was also building up from the revolutionary right. There were those who wanted to restore the old regime and the monarchs. And by 1792, France was at war with Europe's unreformed absolute monarchies, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. They all wanted to stifle that, as they called it, French disease, which was the spread of the revolutionary ideas of liberty and equality. Collectively, these pressures weakened the spirit of compromise, and they were the death knell of the old regime. The Constitution of 1791 expressed a limited constitutional monarchy. It expressed the will of the people as being sovereign, but it was still the voice of those people who owned property. Women, poor men, and so on were just still excluded from political rights. Those without property had no political voice at all. Louis XVI
The king was given a new role and title by this constitution: Louis by the grace of God and the constitutional law of France. He agreed, but he didn't like it. He agreed because he was forced to agree. Secretly, he was planning to escape. Now remember, Marie Antoinette was a member of the Austrian royal family. And so Louis and Marie and their children disguised themselves, and they headed out of town. They were heading to Austria, where they wanted to join exiled troops in opposition to the revolution. Sadly, they didn't make it. They almost made it. They made it almost to the border of France. They were only about half an hour away from the border, and they stopped at an inn and were recognized because Louis's face was on all the money. And so they are hauled back to Paris and thrown in prison. He had subverted the system which he had just technically assisted in making. And we see civil war springing up all over France. A new party took control. This was the Jacobins, so named because they met in an old Jacobin monastery. They were radical revolutionaries who believed that more power needed to go to the people, especially the sans-culotte, the common, ordinary man. In 1792, the National Convention was formed and met. This was the new government formed by the Jacobins, and they took some radical steps. They abolished the monarchy. They executed the king for high treason, and they declared France a republic with democratic voting rights. But the same threats were still present. The ruling Jacobin faction tried to exert effective leadership by issuing decrees. They were very well organized and disciplined, and they were fanatically devoted to the revolution and the republic. The ruling committee within the National Convention was called the Committee of Public Safety, and it ruled through dictatorial measures at the National Convention. Some of the things they tried to do were use economic controls to lower prices, reduce inflation, and ration economic resources. They instituted a general conscription or a draft policy. All able-bodied men, 18 to 40 years of age, were eligible. The reason for this was to create a mass citizen army, drawing on all French men, not just from one class. The Jacobins tried to inspire them with patriotism and the fighting spirit to defend France and the Republic. It was all one and the same to them. France was the Republic. They also instituted an idea known as Nation in Arms, a concept of mobilizing the entire nation for war, something today we call total war. And they relied on terror and suppression or repression to silence all opponents. Enemies of the people were enemies of the revolution. And this is what leads to the Reign of Terror. Anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 people were killed within an 18-month period, all victims of the Jacobins during this 1.5-year period. And most of them were ordinary people. It created just a state of anxiety and fear in society. For example, the Jacobins decreed that everybody was to be addressed as citizen. So when you're walking down the street, you see your neighbor, you don't say, hello, Mr. So-and-so. You say, hello, citizen. If you were found saying, hello, Mr. So-and-so, you could be executed. There was even the case of a teenage girl who just addressed a friend that she saw on the street by her name. She was beheaded. Because so many people were being killed so regularly, if you think about it, up to 40,000 people in an 18-month period, that's deaths every day. But because of that, the guillotine came into common use. And it was actually called the National Razor. And it was really popularized during this time.
And interestingly, it remained a legal form of execution in France up until 1981. So if you lived in France and were convicted of a crime and sentenced to death, you could lose your head by way of the guillotine up till 81. It's in 1981 that France actually abolished capital punishment. The country's last guillotine execution was in 1977. And interesting fact, kind of ironic, Louis XVI earlier had actually helped to perfect the blade on the guillotine so that it would be even more razor sharp, cut more cleanly and quickly. And I say it's very ironic because this is the very machine that ended his life. And just another little note I wanted to make, it's going back to the Bastille. You know, I mentioned how Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette were just totally removed from the problems of their people. And here's an example. July 14th, 1789, the Bastille falls. Like I said, the first act of violence of the Revolution. And Louis XVI, in his diary that day, only wrote the word nothing. So this event wasn't even important enough for him to document. Well, getting back to the Jacobins, their leader was Maximilien Robespierre. He advocated terror because he felt it was necessary to save the Republic from destruction. He was an idealist, and he regarded the Jacobins as bearers of a higher truth. Reason, virtue, citizenship, and patriotism. He felt that a future society would be created containing these ideas, and this would be known as a republic of virtue, a social utopia. But in order to get there, any and all opponents had to be silenced. He thought he was creating this based on the general will of the people. And in order to do that, he believed that terror was necessary. Terror kept obedience and authority, so France could defeat her enemies and overcome problematic domestic policies. And thus we have the Reign of Terror. So the Jacobins defended France and saved the revolution, but their extreme measures aroused fear, panic, and paranoia. In 1794, Robespierre himself was arrested and executed, the charge killing too many people. And in the end, Jacobin policies would lead to a more moderate form of government. And so here you see the actual execution of Robespierre. Well, not the actual execution, but a reproduction. In 1795, a new government was formed. This was the Directory, or the Directorate, a bourgeoisie or middle-class group of business people who came in and tried to pick up the pieces after the Reign of Terror and after Robespierre's execution. It tried to restore stability and order. He wanted to return to the constructive phase, or it wanted to return to the constructive phase of the revolution. Ultimately, though, the Directory also failed because it, for one example, did not effectively administer economic reform or control. They also didn't necessarily know how to govern. They were businessmen. And this weakness allowed the rise to power of a new man who rose through the ranks, a man known as the Little Corporal, and this is Napoleon. And in 1799, Napoleon is going to overthrow the Directory. By this point, the revolution had undergone a decade of turbulence. So what were some of the positives to come out of the French Revolution? By ending aristocratic privilege, it advanced the cause of legal equality and social mobility. By ending the powers of the Catholic Church, it led to religious, civil, and political equality. Jews were equal now,
as were Protestants. It led to a more secular or non-religious society. By abolishing divine rights, it promoted liberal and democratic ideals. By ending unfair tax and legal processes, like the nobility being exempt, a more efficient, standardized legal structure emerged. Well, these ideas spread through Europe, but there were also some negative legacies of the French Revolution. For example, the Jacobin phase showed the destructive potential of any revolution to betray its original ideals. Because think about it, when this revolution began, could anyone have anticipated the Reign of Terror? Is that what they were going for? No. It set a precedent for using mass terror and repression. Think about Hitler. A revolution which started out to improve human society spawned total war, and it created state terror and fanaticism. It will also go on to spread ideas that are going to have a huge impact on the rest of the 19th century, the 19th century as we move into that. So the French Revolution was inspired by the crises of the French state and the ideas of the philosophes, among other things. It unleashed new political beliefs, both positive and negative, and it results in the founding of the modern nation state.